Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 11, Testing and Differences, Part 4, explaining IQ differences among groups. So, how do psychologists explain IQ differences among groups? Well, there is roughly a gap of approximately 15 points that exists between the average IQ score of African Americans and Caucasian Americans. A similar IQ gap separates children from middle income and low income homes. And this leads some to mistaken conclusions that a gap, having a low IQ score, must be innately inferior and should be treated as second class citizens. If we conclude that intelligence is shaped largely by experience or environment, we are more likely to make a range of educational opportunities available for everyone and to view people of all ethnic and cultural and economic groups as equals. Neither hereditarian nor environmentalist views are completely correct. Intelligence and the politics of immigration. Years ago, a man named Henry Goddard was an influential psychologist who believed that intelligence is a hereditary trait, proposed mental testing for all applicants for immigration, and the exclusion of those who were found to be mentally defective. And as a result of his work, our U.S. Congress passed some different legislations. Probably the most noted was the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, which for the most part was designed to restrict immigration of groups and nationalities in which the people had been proven to be of inferior intellect based on largely Goddard's data. And this would include groups of people who were Jews, Russians, and Italians. What Goddard and Congress ignored was the fact that the tests that were given, the IQ test, were given in English. And often the people who were taking these tests had little familiarity with the language and the culture, and hence they scored low. Goddard's research thus is faulty. But unfortunately, the Immigration Act was on the books for years and impacted the number of people that could come into the United States. Matter of fact, when we talk about the number of Jews, this was still a law on the books when we talk about the beginnings of World War II. So, what evidence shows that intelligence is influenced by heredity? Well, studies comparing IQ scores of identical twins and fraternal twins and other siblings who have a strong genetic correlation. Another common approach compares adopted children with their biological and adopted families. And studies have proved that a stronger correlation of siblings and their parents than children that were adopted. The closer the genetic relationship, the closer the relationship of the IQ scores. So children who live in the same family setting do not necessarily share precisely the same psychological environment. So what evidence shows that intelligence is influenced by environment? Well, heredity and group differences. Heritability, for the most part. This is the amount of a trait variation within a group raised under the same conditions that can be attributed to the genetic differences. And heredity is the influence on, as far as your genetics are concerned, on intelligence. Heritability is crucial for understanding that the idea of heredity differences are among individuals who do not imply that heredity accounts for the differences we observe among groups. Heritability tells us nothing about the between group differences. So a group of devoted parents who spends a lot of time interacting with their children, reading to them, were studied. And in this group, IQ would have a higher heritability. A low heritability may exist among children who live in poor environments that lack opportunities for their potentials to be realized. The IQ differences would be real, but our observations could tell us nothing about the genetic differences among groups. And heritability is a concept that refers to within group differences and not between group differences. So if you take a look at heredity, obviously, you probably have seen some of this in maybe your A&P class, but needless to say, it's still a very controversial subject. And just adding to this is the Jensen controversy. Arthur Jensen stirred up the hornet's nest of controversy with his contention that racial differences in IQ have a genetic basis. We can boost IQ scores to some extent by helping poor and disadvantaged, but there are limits imposed by heredity. Critics pointed out that several factors that Jensen had minimized or ignored, including the effects of racism, lower teacher expectations for Black students, and the lack of opportunity and low self-esteem, and a white middle-class bias built into the whole structure of IQ and achievement test. The Scar and Weinberg adoption study, Sandra Scar and Richard Weinberg confronted the issue head on by comparing Black and white children who had been adopted into similar home environments. The research focused on the educational records and IQ scores from both the biological and adopted families of 115 white children and 176 Black children who had been adopted in the state of Minnesota during the 1950s. All the children who had been adopted into the white families, there was no differences between the two groups. Both Black children and the white children adoptees had scores that averaged around 110 as far as your IQ. This is significantly higher than their biological parents. Social class and IQ. Research on the relationship between social class and IQ shows similar environmental effects. Social economic class is clearly correlated with IQ. Poverty creates a circumstance that limits individual potentials in many ways, particularly in terms of nutrition, healthcare, and education. The U.S. public school systems are funded by revenue from local property taxes. Wealthy neighborhoods can provide bigger and better school facilities with all the wonderful amenities, all the bells and whistles, while poor school districts may suffer from crowding, physical deteriorating structures, threats to personal safety, and have few extras as far as media centers or computers to offer. Head Start is a successful intervention program, an intervention program that was implemented over 50 years ago, dating back to the 1960s. To provide educational enrichment for disadvantaged children, serving children's physical as well as their mental needs with nutritional and medical support, plus a year or two of preschool education. Head Start involves parents in the policymaking, planning of programs, and working in the classroom, learning about parenting and child development. And Head Start serves well over 800,000 children yearly. Children who are enrolled in the program score typically higher on IQ tests and have a higher school achievement during the early grades than a matched control group. Head Start children are less likely to be placed in special education classes, less likely to fail a grade, and more likely to graduate from high school. So in a way, that shows you maybe the economic bonus of having Head Start programs. Test biases. This is another force that influences IQ scores and contributes to differences among groups. A portion of the difference between the average IQ score of Black and white children may be attributed to problems with the IQ test itself. Many psychologists argue that IQ test questions have built-in biases towards middle and upper class people. thus biasing or favoring white students. One source possibly stems from the fact that most IQ tests rely heavily on vocabulary. And because expectations can also affect IQ scores, psychologists have argued that lowered expectations among minority groups about their own potential can contribute to racial differences in IQ. The examiner could also be biased. And finally, a woman named Janet Helm has pointed out that the attempt to explain why African American children deviate from Caucasian norms may itself rest on the biased assumption that one culture is superior to another, which is something that is obviously deeply rooted. So moving on, the bell curve. This is another hereditarian uh, offense or defense, if you want to call it that, and also a very controversial book. This dispute over the racial differences in IQ flared up in 1980 or 1994 with the book The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. And it was authored by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. Ornstein and Murray argued that the racial differences in IQ have a strong genetic basis. So, how is the bell curve flawed? The answer may be familiar to you. While there is no doubt that heredity influences individual intelligence, Herrnstein and Murray, like hereditarians before them, have offered no proof that the differences between groups exposed to different environments have a hereditary basis. So, compounding the problem in their analysis of evidence, Herrnstein and Murray commit another scientific error. They confuse correlation with causation and poverty and all the other social and economic disadvantages that go with it could just as well be important causes to the low IQ scores. So the bell curve has struck a chord with Americans. It resonates with the preference for simple genetic causes for behavior rather than the more complex explanations that exist. So, wrapping up here, psychology in your own life, helping others uh, to think critically about group differences. One of the last things I want to mention here is a very, very controversial here, and perhaps the most persuasive argument against the genetic interpretation of group differences is that many other variables are confounded with race, including racism, poverty, self-fulfilling prophecies, the differential opportunities of education, each of which can influence your IQ scores. And years ago, there was a theory called eugenics, very, very controversial. It was a philosophy and a political movement that encouraged biologically superior people to interbreed and sought to discourage biologically inferior people from having offsprings. So if you can think about, the U.S. history of racism during the 20th century, eugenics was certainly there, and not only just here in the United States, but there's great evidence of that in Europe, particularly among Germans, during the era leading up to the Second World War. So, in the extreme racist interpreters of the genetic argument, this supports eugenics programs that would limit breeding by undesirable groups. So laws restricting immigration of certain groups or legal inequality that favored certain groups being in power. So yeah, this is tragic and blatantly racist all at the same time. Thank you very much.